Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a chamber deep beneath the mountain fortress they call the Fang. It sits far below the howling winds that scour the peaks of Asserheim, far beneath the feasting halls where warriors raise their cups and sing songs of glory to a father who left them 10,000 years ago. Down in the cold stone belly of that mountain, where the air tastes of recycled oil and the hum of ancient generators vibrates through the bedrock like a mechanical heartbeat. Yet there are rows of armored sarcophagi standing like sentinels in the darkness. Most of them are silent. Some of them are cold, their occupants long since granted the final mercy of true death. But one of them, one particular sarcophagus, bearing more battle honors and runic inscriptions than perhaps any other single object in the entire Imperium of man, still hums with the faint pulse of life support, still flickers with the ghostlight of active neural connections, still holds, yet within its adamantium shell, the oldest living warrior humanity has ever known. His name is Bjorn. They call him the Fell-handed, they call him the eldest, they call him Trueclaw, the revered one, and the last from the company of Russ. He has more titles than most chapters have battle honors, and every single one of them was earned in blood and sorrow across a span of time that staggers the imagination. More than 10,000 standard Terran years have passed since the Age of Legends. Since the Emperor walked among his people and the Primarchs led their legions across the stars. And in all that inconceivable span of history, through every war and every silence, through every awakening and every cold descent back into the dreamless void of stasis, Bjorn has endured. He is not merely old, he is ancient beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. Empires have risen and crumbled to dust in the time he has spent sleeping beneath the Fang. Entire species have evolved and gone extinct. Stars have been born and died. The Imperium itself has transformed from the bright, conquering civilization of the Great Crusade into the rotting, desperate theocracy of the 41st Millennium. And still Bjorn persists. Trapped inside a walking tomb of blessed ceramite and adamantium, his ruined body sustained by machines that were old when the current chapter master's great-great-grandfather was a screaming infant on the ice plains of Fenris. He is the oldest Dreadnought in the Imperium, the oldest loyal space marine still drawing something that might generously be called breath. And he carries within his battered shell the last living memories of an age that has otherwise passed entirely into myth. And that, more than anything else, is what makes his story so remarkable. Not the battles he has fought, though they are legendary, not the enemies he has slain, though their names would fill volumes, as not even the impossible span of his existence, though it dwarfs anything else in the recorded history of the Adeptus Astartes. What makes Bjorn's story worth telling, what makes it worth settling in for and truly absorbing, is the weight of everything he has carried. The loneliness, the grief, the bitter, grinding endurance of a warrior who has outlived everything and everyone he ever loved, and who fights on anyway, not because a machine compels him to, but because somewhere deep inside that metal shell, a stubborn, furious, deeply human soul refuses to stop. So let us go back. Let us travel 10,000 years into the past, to a world of ice and fire, to a time when gods walked among men and the galaxy was still young enough to dream of something better. Let us begin at the beginning, as all good sagas do, with the world that made him. Fenris is not a kind world. It has never been kind, and it never will be. It is a death world in the truest sense of the term, a planet that seems to exist for no other purpose than to kill everything that dares to live upon its surface. Situated in the galactic south of the segmentum obscurus, uncomfortably close to the vast wound in reality known as the Eye of Terror, Fenris orbits its star in an erratic, elongated path that subjects the planet to extremes of temperature that would be considered absurd anywhere else in the galaxy. Was when Fenris swings close to its sun, the great oceans boil. Tectonic upheavals tear the land apart, in what the locals call the season of fire, birthing new islands from the molten depths while swallowing old ones beneath the waves. When the orbit carries the planet far from its star, those same oceans freeze solid, and temperatures plummet to levels that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The only stable landmass is the continent of Ascension, a frozen expanse of mountains and tundra that rises above the chaos of the shifting seas, like the spine of some impossibly vast beast. And it is on Ascension, at the peak of the tallest mountain, that the Fang rises into the sky, the fortress monastery of the Space Wolves. Many Imperial scholars consider it the greatest bastion of the Imperium outside of the Imperial Palace on Terra itself. It is a mountain hollowed out and reinforced, its halls carved from living rock and fitted with void shields and weapons batteries capable of repelling an orbital bombardment. Its roots plunge deep into the earth, and its peak rises above the atmosphere itself, where the chapter's void ships dock like iron birds returning to their nest. But the Fang is more than a fortress. It is a home, a gathering place. It's a hall of heroes where sagas are sung and mead is poured, and the deeds of the fallen are remembered with a passion that borders on the sacred. The Space Wolves are not like other chapters, where the Ultramarines follow the Codex Astartes with near-religious devotion, where the Dark Angels cloak themselves in secrecy and shame. The Space Wolves embrace the savage culture of their homeworld with a ferocity that sometimes alarms their allies and always terrifies their enemies. But they organize themselves not into companies, but into great companies, each led by a wolf lord who commands his warriors like a tribal chieftain, leading his people into battle. They feast, they drink, they boast of their kills and challenge each other to contests of strength and skill. They adorn their armor with runic inscriptions and wolf totems and the pelts of the great beasts they have slain. They are Vikings in power armor, berserkers with bolters, and they wouldn't have it any other way. The fauna of Fenris deserves its own mention because it is the fauna, more than anything else, that shapes the people who live there. Fenrisian wolves are not the quaint, dog-sized creatures that the word wolf might conjure in the minds of those who have never visited a death world. They are vast, semi-sentient predators, some as large as warhorses, with iron-hard teeth and jaws that can exert pressure comparable to the great sea predators of the deep ocean. They hunt in packs, are led by alpha males of terrifying size and cunning, and they are merely the most common of the wolf species that roam Ascension. The black-maned wolf is larger still, a beast that stands as tall and muscular as an ancient warhorse, with jaws capable of hunting the largest prey through the thickest blizzard. And above even the black-maned wolf sits the legendary Thunderwolf, a creature approaching the size of a rhino-armored carrier, with multiple rows of teeth in perpetual growth, and a temperament that makes the average Fenrisian wolf seem tame by comparison. The Fenrisians venerate these creatures as spiritual totems. The Space Wolves ride them into battle, and in doing so, they embody a philosophy that permeates every aspect of their culture. If the universe is full of things that want to kill you, the best response is to tame the most dangerous predator you can find and ride it into the face of your enemies. But the wolves are only part of the lethal ecology. Fenris is home to krakens that lurk in the depths of its shifting oceans, beasts of such immense size that they can drag entire longships beneath the waves. Cave bears prowl the mountain passes, each one a match for a dozen armed men. Ice trolls, mastodons, and creatures that defy easy classification stalk the frozen wastes, turning every journey across the tundra into a test of survival, and every meal into a hard-fought victory. But the human tribes that cling to existence among these horrors are, by necessity, among the toughest and most resourceful populations in the galaxy. They are born warriors, from cradle to grave, battling not only the planetary conditions, but each other in constant tribal feuds over the most precious commodity on a world where the very land beneath your feet might sink into the boiling sea at any moment. Solid ground. The Fenrisians take to the shifting seas in simple wooden longships they call dragon ships, vessels that would not look out of place in the sagas of old Earth's Norse peoples. They raid each other's settlements, they compete for hunting grounds, They celebrate their victories with feasts of roasted meat and potent mead brewed from whatever hardy grains managed to grow in the brief Fenrisian growing season. And they tell stories. Stories of the sky warriors who live above the clouds. The demigods who descend from the mountain of the gods to claim the worthiest young men for a war that spans the stars. These stories are not myths. They are true. The sky warriors are the space wolves, and the mountain of the gods is the Fang. This is the crucible that produces the raw material for the sons of Russ. The wolf priests of the chapter watch the tribal wars, and the beast hunts from a distance, hidden among the peaks and the glaciers, us observing the young warriors who show exceptional promise. They look for the ones who fight with particular ferocity, who show cunning in the face of overwhelming odds, who refuse to die when death would be the sensible option. These young men, often chosen from those who have fallen in battle with mortal wounds, so grievous that their tribes have given them up for dead, are taken to the Fang. There, they are feasted and toasted until they are full and drunk, as celebrating what they believe is their ascension to the halls of the gods. And then, while they sleep, the transformation begins. The first gene seed organs are implanted, the canis helix begins its agonizing work on their bodies, and when they wake, naked and shivering in the endless snow, with nothing but a knife and a belly full of burning transformation, they must find their way back to the Fang or die in the attempt. Those who survive earn the right to become blood claws, and the youngest and most ferocious warriors of the chapter, and to begin the long journey toward becoming a fully fledged warrior of the Emperor. The journey from blood claw to long Fang, from the hot-headed berserker of youth to the grizzled veteran of centuries, mirrors the journey of all living things on Fenris. It is a process of hardening, of tempering, of having every soft edge worn away by the grinding attrition of a hostile universe. The Bloodclaws charge into battle with reckless abandon, is their young blood singing with the thrill of combat. The Grey Hunters, the mature warriors who form the backbone of each great company, fight with disciplined efficiency and the quiet confidence that comes from decades of experience. And the Longfangs, those ancient veterans whose literal canine teeth have grown to wolfish proportions as a result of the canis helix, provide the devastating heavy weapon support that anchors the Space Wolves' battle line. It is a progression from fire to ice, as from passion to purpose, from the unbridled fury of youth to the cold, calculating precision of age. This is the culture that shaped the Imperium's oldest warrior. This is the world that bred him, that carved him from ice and iron, and filled his veins with a fury that 10,000 years of mechanical existence has never quite managed to extinguish. Before the Dreadnought, before the sarcophagus, before the long millennia of sleeping and waking and sleeping again, there was a young man with black braided hair and a temperament that his companions described, with considerable understatement, as sullen. His name, in the tongue of his people, meant bear. And like the great predators of Fenris, he was solitary by nature, fierce when provoked, and absolutely, uncompromisingly relentless when he set his mind to something. The first record of Bjorn in Imperial archives comes from the closing years of the Great Crusade, that magnificent and terrible era when the Emperor of mankind led his forces across the galaxy to reunite the scattered remnants of human civilization. Bjorn served in the Vulca Fenrica, the Wolves of Fenris, as a member of the Third Great Company, known in the Old Tongue as Tra. He fought under the command of Jarl Ogvi Helmshot, and his reputation was that of a capable and dedicated warrior, if not yet a particularly distinguished one. He was good at killing things. He was dependable in a fight. He had a tendency to brood. In a chapter full of boisterous, ale-swilling warriors who wore their emotions like badges of honor, Bjorn's quiet intensity set him apart, and not always in a way that endeared him to his brothers. His first notable act, in fact, was a mistake. During the arrival of the remembrancer, Caspar Horsa, on Fenris, Bjorn mistakenly identified Horsa's shuttle as a threat and shot it out of the sky. The craft crashed, and Horsa very nearly died in the wreckage. It was an error born of vigilance rather than malice, but it was an error nonetheless, and as a form of penance, Bjorn was assigned to serve as Horsa's guardian. It was a duty he accepted with visible reluctance and a simmering irritation that made Horsa's early days among the Space Wolves considerably more stressful than they needed to be. But this reluctant guardianship would prove to be one of those small, as seemingly insignificant moments that the hand of fate uses to redirect the course of history, because it was Bjorn's bond with Caspar Horsa that would lead him to the pivotal moment of his life, the event that would transform him from an unremarkable warrior of Tra into the stuff of legend, the event that would cost him his arm, earn him his name, and set him on a path that would stretch across 10 millennia of blood and fire and sorrow. That event was the Battle of Prospero. And to understand what happened there, to truly grasp the horror and the heroism of it, we need to understand the forces that brought two of the Emperor's own legions into mortal conflict with each other. We need to understand the political and spiritual earthquake that shook the foundations of the Imperium long before Horus raised his banner of rebellion, and the chain of decisions, each one seemingly reasonable in isolation, that together created a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The Imperium during the Great Crusade was a civilization at war with itself on a fundamental, philosophical level. The Emperor had proclaimed the imperial truth, a doctrine of aggressive secularism that held there were no gods, no spirits, no supernatural forces of any kind. The warp was merely a dimension of psychic energy, dangerous, but ultimately understandable through the lens of science and reason. Psychers, those humans who could tap into the power of the warp, were useful tools when properly controlled, and dangerous liabilities when they were not. The Emperor himself was the most powerful psyker in human history, but he rejected any suggestion of divinity and insisted that his abilities were natural, if extraordinary, products of human evolution. This philosophy created a deep tension within the Legiones Astartes, because several of the Primarchs and their legions relied heavily on psychic abilities in both warfare and daily life. None more so than Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons. Magnus was a scholar, a seeker of forbidden knowledge, a being whose hunger for understanding was matched only by his power. His legion had embraced the study and use of psychic abilities to a degree that alarmed many of their brother legions, and rumors of sorcery and forbidden practices had dogged the 1,000 Sons for decades. The Council of Nicaea had been a turning point for the entire Imperium, convened by the Emperor himself to address the growing concern over the use of psychic powers among the Space Marine legions. The Council gathered representatives from across the Imperium to debate the question. The 1,000 Sons argued passionately for the continued use of psychic abilities, insisting that they were a gift that could be harnessed safely and wielded responsibly. Others, including many within the Space Wolves, argued that the warp was inherently corrupting and that any use of psychic power, no matter how well-intentioned, opened the door to demonic influence and spiritual contamination. The Emperor's ruling was unambiguous. The Edict of Nicaea declared that the use of sorcery and psychic powers by the Legiones Astartes was forbidden. The Librarius divisions were to be disbanded. Those who had wielded the power of the warp in battle were to set aside their gifts and return to the ranks as ordinary warriors. Only the Space Wolves' own rune priests were exempted, their abilities deemed sufficiently different from sorcery to be acceptable, a distinction that the 1,000 Sons found bitterly hypocritical. For the 1,000 Sons, the scholarly and deeply psychic legion of Magnus the Red, this ruling was a devastating blow. Their entire identity was built around the pursuit and mastery of psychic knowledge. Their Primarch was one of the most powerful psychers in the galaxy, second, perhaps only to the Emperor himself. The edict felt like a rejection of everything they were, a decree that the core of their being was inherently wrong and needed to be suppressed. The seeds of resentment were planted deep, and they would bear terrible fruit in the years to come. And it was Magnus who would commit the act that brought the Space Wolves to his doorstep with murder in their hearts. When Horus, the War Master, fell to the corruption of chaos and began his rebellion against the Emperor, Magnus used his considerable psychic abilities to try to warn Terra of the betrayal. But in doing so, He breached the psychic wards that protected the imperial palace, causing catastrophic damage to the emperor's secret project, or the construction of a vast psychic conduit beneath the palace that would later become known as the Golden Throne. The emperor was furious. And when the emperor was furious, there was one legion. He called upon to deliver his judgment, the Space Wolves, the emperor's executioners. Leman Russ received his orders. He was to bring Magnus to Terra to answer for his actions. But the orders were corrupted, twisted by the machinations of Horus himself. And by the time Russ arrived at the Thousand Suns homeworld of Prospero, he was not coming to arrest Magnus. He was coming to destroy him. Bjorn was there. He was part of Tra, the Third Company, and he descended upon Prospero alongside his brothers with all the fury and discipline that the Space Wolves were known for. The world burned. Towers of crystal and marble that had stood for centuries came crashing down under the bombardment. Libraries containing the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years were consumed by fire. The Thousand Suns, caught between their desire to defend their home and their horror at fighting their own brothers, fell in droves beneath the bolters and blades of the wolves. But it was inside one of the structures built by the Thousand Suns that Bjorn's true saga began. Caspar Horsa, the Remembrancer, whom Bjorn had been assigned to protect, but found himself confronted by something that should not have existed, a being of pure malice, a demon that had taken the form of the War Master Horus himself, had been lurking within the psychic architecture of the building. This entity had been manipulating Horsa for years, using him as an unwitting spy against the Space Wolves, and now it revealed itself in all its terrible glory. Horsa fought it. He planted his axe into the creature's head, an act of defiance that was as brave as it was futile. The demon began to choke the life out of him, and it might have succeeded if not for the arrival of reinforcements from Tra. Several of Bjorn's brothers rushed to Horsa's aid, but the demon possessed a terrible weapon. Through its psychic link with Horsa, it knew the true names of every space wolf the Remembrancer had ever encountered. And in the lore of Fenris, to know a warrior's true name is to hold power over him. One by one, the demon called out the names of Bjorn's brothers, and one by one, they fell. But when it reached for Bjorn's name, something remarkable happened. The demon could not find it. It searched through Horsa's memories and found only the name Bear, the rough, low-Gothic translation that Horsa had been using since they first met. Bjorn's true name, the name given to him by his people in the tongue of Fenris, was hidden behind a wall of linguistic confusion that the demon could not penetrate. Horsa had been calling him by the wrong name all along, and so, while his brothers lay broken and dying around him, Bjorn fought on. He hacked the demon's arm off at the elbow, saving Horsa's life, with a blow that sent dark ichor spattering across the shattered floor. He pressed his advantage, dealing the creature several devastating strikes with his weapons. But the demon was no mortal foe. It refused to fall, and in its fury, it reached out with fell sorcery and set Bjorn's left arm ablaze with eldritch balefire. The corruption began to crawl up his limb, eating into his flesh and threatening to consume him entirely. What happened next varies depending on which account you read. In some versions, it was Horsa himself who grabbed an axe and severed Bjorn's arm just below the elbow, cutting away the corrupted flesh before the balefire could spread any further. In others, it was Constantin Valdor of the Legio Custodes who performed the amputation. Regardless of who held the blade, the result was the same. Bjorn's arm was cut away, the corruption was stopped, and help arrived in the form of 2 Space Wolves Dreadnoughts, a squad of Sisters of Silence, and a rune priest, who together managed to destroy the demon, now that its power had been disrupted by the pariah gene of the Silent Sisterhood. Bjorn survived. On. He was the only Space Wolf who had fought the demon directly and lived to tell the tale. His arm was gone, replaced later by a cybernetic augment, but his reputation was made. Word of his defiance spread through the ranks of the 6th Legion like wildfire, and the Skalds began to weave his name into the sagas with an enthusiasm that the brooding young warrior found distinctly uncomfortable. When they found him in the aftermath, battered and bloodied and missing a limb, More, it was Leman Russ himself who came to see the young warrior. Bjorn introduced himself with characteristic bluntness. "Bjorn, of Tra," he said, "one-handed." Russ looked at the young warrior, at the cauterized stump where his arm had been, at the stubborn defiance that still burned in his eyes despite everything he had just endured. "That is a poor name," the Primarch replied. And Bjorn, but with a coolness that bordered on insolence in the presence of a being who could have crushed him with one hand, flexed what remained of his ruined arm and answered, "It suits. It stands for all of us." In that moment, something passed between the Primarch and the warrior. A recognition, perhaps, an understanding. Bjorn's loss, his grief, his stubborn refusal to be broken by the horrors of Prospero. These things resonated with Russ in a way that went beyond mere admiration. But Bjorn would not receive his famous title just yet. That honor was still to come, earned not on the ash-covered plains of Prospero, but on a volcanic hellscape far from home, in a battle that would nearly destroy him and instead remake him forever. The aftermath of the Battle of Prospero was one of chaos and uncertainty. The heresy was spreading, the Imperium was tearing itself apart, and the Space Wolves found themselves hunted by enemies they had never expected to face. The Alpha Legion, those masters of subterfuge and misdirection, ambushed the wolves in the Alaxis Nebula, catching them while they were still reeling from the psychic and emotional toll of destroying Prospero. Bjorn was aboard the ship Hellridder when the Alpha Legion struck. Traitor boarding parties flooded through the corridors of the vessel, their unpainted armor and shifting insignia making them nightmarishly difficult to distinguish from one another. Bjorn and his pack fought their way through corridors slick with blood and cordite, cutting down the borders with the brutal efficiency that was becoming his hallmark. But the Hellridder was being overwhelmed, and Bjorn made the decision to fight his way to the Wolf King's flagship, the Hrafnkel, where the bulk of the chapter's command structure was located. The journey between ships in the middle of a boarding action was a desperate, violent affair. At one point, Bjorn and his pack found themselves face to face with a traitor Contemptor Dreadnought, a massive war engine that should have been more than a match for a handful of infantry, no matter how elite. They were saved at the last possible moment by the intervention of Leman Russ himself, who appeared like a force of nature and destroyed the traitor machine with the kind of casual, devastating violence that only a Primarch could manage. But even as the immediate threat of the Alpha Legion was dealt with, a deeper crisis was brewing. Leman Russ had fallen into a terrible despair. The burning of Prospero weighed on him. The realization that he had been manipulated by Horus, that his own hot-headed nature had been used as a weapon against his brother Magnus, was eating at the Wolf King's soul like acid. He was retreating into himself, becoming listless and unfocused, questioning his role as the Emperor's executioner with an intensity that threatened to paralyze his ability to command. It was Bjorn who roused him. The young warrior, still missing his arm, still carrying the psychic scars of his encounter with the demon, stood before his Primarch and spoke words that would echo through the millennia. The exact dialogue has been lost to the fog of history, but the substance is clear from every account. As Bjorn convinced Russ to stop blindly serving as the Emperor's attack dog and to forge his own path, to think for himself, to lead rather than simply obey. It was a moment of extraordinary courage. A rank-and-file warrior telling his genetically engineered demigod of a father to get a grip on himself and start acting like the leader his legion needed him to be. The fact that Russ listened, that he took the words of this sullen, yet one-armed young warrior to heart and used them as the foundation for a new philosophy of command, tells us more about Bjorn's character than any battle honor ever could. This same defiance, this same stubborn refusal to be paralyzed by despair, would later carry Bjorn through experiences that would have broken lesser warriors. The ritual at Surtur's door on Fenris, for instance, where Russ journeyed into the Underverse and left Bjorn with a simple instruction: do not turn around until I return, and no matter what happens. Bjorn obeyed. And as the demons came, as they claimed the rune priests one by one, whispering honeyed lies and screaming blasphemies into the darkness, Bjorn did not turn around. He stood with his back to the abyss, and his face to the light, and he endured. Because that is what Bjorn does. He endures. The heresy ground on. Worlds burned. Brothers fought brothers. As the very fabric of the Imperium was torn and stitched, and torn again, in a war that consumed millions of lives and left scars that would never fully heal. And through it all, Bjorn fought with a ferocity and a determination that drew the attention of his Primarch. During the Great Scouring, the massive counteroffensive that followed the defeat of Horus and the interment of the Emperor upon the Golden Throne, Bjorn proved his worth 100 times over. He was tireless, relentless, and possessed of a tactical acumen that belied his relative youth among the warriors of the Legion. But it was on the volcanic world of Grith that Bjorn would face the trial that defined him. His pack was assigned to assault a position held by the forces of chaos, a mission that seemed routine by the blood-soaked standards of the Scouring. What they found instead was Arvax the Arch-Slaughterer, a demon of Khorne so powerful that its very presence warped the air around it into a heat haze of rage and bloodlust. The battle was a massacre, not of the enemy, but of Bjorn's own pack. His brothers, warriors who had fought beside him through Prospero and the Alaxis Nebula and a dozen other campaigns, fell one after another before the unstoppable fury of the Demon King. Arvax was a being of pure violence given form, a towering nightmare of brass and sinew and malice that radiated an aura of bloodlust so intense that it warped the very air around it. Bolt rounds sparked harmlessly off its brazen hide. Power swords shattered against its skin like glass against granite. One by one, Bjorn's packmates died, their bodies broken and their blood soaking into the volcanic ash of Grith, adding their lives to the endless tithe of suffering that the blood god demanded of his champions. Every warrior who faced the Arch-Slaughterer that day died. Every single one, except Bjorn, the young warrior, already missing his arm, already carrying the psychic scars of his encounter with the demon on Prospero, fought with a desperation born not of courage, but of refusal. He refused to die. He refused to join his brothers in the ash. He refused, with the stubborn, teeth-gritted defiance that would become his most characteristic trait, to give the demon the satisfaction of killing every member of his pack. By the time Leman Russ arrived with reinforcements and drove the demonic host back, Bjorn was the last warrior standing. His remaining arm was drenched in the black ichor of lesser demons he had slain in the fighting. His armor was cracked and scorched, and in his eyes there was something that had not been there before, something cold, something patient, something very, very dangerous. And Bjorn blamed himself. But in the hours after the battle, Bjorn refused all congratulations. He refused comfort. He refused the hearty approval of those who had witnessed his heroic survival, the well-meaning slaps on the pauldron, and the raised cups that his brothers offered in tribute to his resilience. He refused ale and food and companionship. While the rest of the warband celebrated the victory that Russ's arrival had secured, Bjorn knelt before the burning pyres where his brothers' bodies were being consumed by flame, and he gave voice to a long, mournful howl that those who heard it would remember for the rest of their lives. It was not a sound of grief exactly, or at least not grief alone. It was the sound of something inside him crystallizing, hardening, transforming from the soft tissue of sorrow into something far more durable and far more dangerous, and then, and his voice raw and his eyes burning with something far more lethal than mere grief, Bjorn swore an oath. He became the first lone wolf in the chapter's history, a warrior who separated himself from the pack structure of the Legion and dedicated himself entirely to a single, consuming purpose. He would find Arvax. He would hunt the demon across the width and breadth of the galaxy if he had to, and he would kill it. Not for glory, not for honor, for vengeance, pure and simple, for the brothers who had been taken from him. 5 years passed before word of Arvax's location surfaced again. 5 years of waiting and searching and nursing a cold, black fury that only grew stronger with time. When the intelligence finally came, Leman Russ was determined to lead the assault personally. The Wolf King wanted to kill the Demon King himself, to avenge those who had fallen on Greith. But fate had other plans. As Russ tore through the horde of lesser demons that surrounded their quarry, Bjorn was faster. Driven by 5 years of compressed rage, he found Arvax first, and in a duel that the Skalds would sing about for 10,000 years, Bjorn fought the arch-slaughterer alone. He ducked beneath a blow that would have cut him in half. He climbed the demon's towering frame with his bare hands and his wolf claw, scaling the being like a mountaineer ascending a cliff of living bronze. And at the summit, with the roar of the demon filling his ears and the stench of brimstone burning his lungs, Bjorn tore out the arch-slaughtera's throat with his wolf claw. Russ watched the whole thing. He had fought through the horde specifically to reach Arvax, only to arrive just in time to see a one-armed warrior from the Third Company accomplish what an entire pack of space wolves had failed to do 5 years earlier. In the aftermath of the battle, the Wolf King came to Bjorn in person, and he exonerated him before the entire chapter, declaring his oath of vengeance fulfilled. And then, in a gesture that would set a precedent lasting to the present day, Russ promoted Bjorn to his personal wolf guard and gave him a new name, not Bjorn the One-Handed, as the young warrior had bitterly been calling himself, not Bjorn of Tra, as the records listed him. From that day forward, in honor of the mighty deed he had accomplished with his remaining hand and his unbreakable will, he would be known as Bjorn the Fell-Handed. The arm that had been taken from him on Prospero had become, paradoxically, the source of his greatest glory. What was meant to be a wound became a weapon. What was meant to be a loss became a legend. The promotion to Russ's personal wolf guard was the highest honor a warrior of the 6th Legion could receive. It meant that Bjorn walked beside his Primarch, fought at his side, and was entrusted with the Wolf King's most sacred duties and deepest confidences. It was a position of extraordinary trust and extraordinary responsibility, and it was from this position, at the very center of the Space Wolves' command structure, that Bjorn would witness the event that would shatter his world for the second time and shape the rest of his impossibly long existence. Lemon Russ vanished in 211 of the 31st Millennium, us nearly 2 standard centuries after the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne. It happened during the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, when all of the Space Wolves' wolf lords and their warriors were gathered in the Great Hall of the Fang on Fenris. The holiday commemorated the day the Emperor defeated Horus, and it was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of unity and remembrance. A chance for the warriors of the chapter to set aside the burdens of the endless campaigns of the Great Scouring and simply be together as brothers in the hall of their father. The Great Hall of the Fang is one of the most magnificent spaces in the entire Imperium. Carved from the living rock of the mountain, its walls are hung with the pelts of great beasts and the banners of 1,000 campaigns. Long tables of ancient wood, scarred and stained by centuries of use, and stretch from one end of the hall to the other, laden with roasted meats and barrels of mead that have been brewed according to recipes that predate the founding of the Imperium itself. The air is thick with the smoke of cooking fires and the sound of voices raised in song and boast and laughter. Fenrisian wolves lie beneath the tables, gnawing on bones and occasionally snarling at bloodclaws who get too close. It is a place of warmth and brotherhood and fierce, uncomplicated joy. And on the night of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, it was full. Every wolf lord was there. Every great company was represented. The chapter's greatest heroes sat at the head of the table, their armor set aside in favor of the traditional furs and leathers of Fenrisian celebration. Bjorn was among them, seated in a position of honor as a member of the Primarch's Wolf Guard, his cybernetic arm gleaming in the firelight, and his expression bearing its customary aspect of mild irritation at the noise and revelry around him. He had never been one for celebrations, but even Bjorn could feel the warmth of the hall, the sense of belonging that came from being surrounded by brothers who would die for each other without hesitation. And then, Lemon Russ rose from his seat. Instead, it became the most devastating moment in the history of the Space Wolves. Leman Russ rose from his seat to speak. He was the Wolf King, Shep the Primarch, the genetic father of every warrior in that hall, and when he stood, every eye turned to him with the unquestioning devotion that only a Primarch could inspire. The hall fell silent. Every cup was set down. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. When Russ spoke, you listened. That was not a rule. It was a law of nature. But Russ did not speak. Instead, he froze, his eyes glazing over as if he were seeing something that no one else in the hall could perceive. A vision, perhaps. A premonition. A call from somewhere beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. The firelight played across his features, illuminating an expression that shifted from surprise to recognition to something that might have been resignation, all in the space of a few heartbeats. The assembled space wolves watched in growing horror as their Primarch fell to his knees. The mead cups that had been raised in anticipation of a toast hung motionless in the air. Yet the songs died on lips that were suddenly dry. In that vast hall, among hundreds of the most fearsome warriors in the galaxy, the silence was absolute. When Russ rose again, his face had changed. There was a terrible certainty in his eyes, a finality that chilled the blood of every warrior present. He looked around the hall, his gaze passing over the faces of his sons, with an expression that those who witnessed it would later describe as valedictory. He was saying goodbye, not with words, not yet, but with the look in his eyes. Every space wolf in that hall understood, on some level deeper than conscious thought, that something irrevocable was about to happen.
I'll take a quick second here to just talk to you directly, because this is the part of Bjorn's story that honestly hits me the hardest every time I revisit it. There are so many cool characters in this setting, so many powerful warriors and massive battles, but what gets me about Bjorn is that his whole legend comes from pain. Like every single title he carries was paid for it with something he lost. And I think that is what makes him resonate so differently from someone like Khulgar or Dante or even Gulliman. Those guys are inspiring because of what they achieved. Bjorn is inspiring because of what he survived. And I know a lot of you in the comments have told me that Bjorn is your favorite character for exactly that reason. So if this is your first time hearing his full story, I really hope it lands the same way for you. But anyways, let's go back to the video now.
Russ called for his wolf guard, his closest companions and most trusted warriors, to attend him. He gave them instructions that have never been fully recorded, orders so secret that not even Bjorn, who was present for the beginning of the exchange, was privy to their full content. Yet he promised that he would return when the final battle, the wolf time, was upon them. He spoke of a destiny that awaited him beyond the borders of the material world, a task that only he could accomplish, and that could not be delayed. And then he left. He walked out of the great hall with his honor guard in tow, heading for a destination that no one knew and a fate that no one could predict. He took every member of his personal bodyguard with him, every one, except the youngest, except Bjorn. Must try to imagine what that felt like. Try to put yourself in the place of a warrior who had lost his arm fighting a demon, who had lost his entire pack to another demon, who had fought his way through the worst war in human history, and emerged with his sanity and his will intact, only to watch the being he loved and revered above all others walk away without explanation. Russ left no note. He offered no rationale. He simply looked at Bjorn, the youngest of his wolf guard, and left him behind. Yet the skalds of the chapter would later construct an elaborate justification for this decision. They would say that Russ recognized in Bjorn a unique combination of strength, determination, and emotional resilience that made him the only member of the Wolf Guard capable of bearing the lonely burden of command in the Primarch's absence. They would say that Russ left Bjorn behind because he trusted him more than any other warrior, because he knew that Bjorn's cold, her stubborn anger would keep him alive and sane through whatever trials lay ahead. Bjorn himself has never accepted this explanation. Even after 10,000 years, even after everything that has happened since that day, the Fell-Handed still harbors intense feelings of rejection and bitterness when he recounts the story of Russ's departure. His voice, filtered through 10 millennia of mechanical speakers and synthesized vocalization, still falters at this point in the telling. The only moment where the oldest warrior in the Imperium shows vulnerability is when he speaks of the father who left him behind. But Bjorn did not crumble. He did not rage or weep or retreat into the comfort of despair. He did what he has always done. He endured. And more than that, he led. In the immediate aftermath of Russ's disappearance, Bjorn gathered every warrior of the Space Wolves in the Great Hall of the Fang and announced the first great hunt. Yet the chapter would seek out their lost king. Every great company would take to the stars, sailing in a different direction, searching the galaxy for any trace of Leman Russ. It was a mission born of love and grief and desperate hope, and it established a tradition that continues to this day. The great companies of the Space Wolves still conduct great hunts, still search the farthest reaches of the galaxy for their missing father. And Bjorn himself assumed the role that Russ had implicitly left for him. He became the first great wolf of the Space Wolves, the chapter master, the supreme commander of one of the most formidable fighting forces in the Imperium of Man. It was a role he held with distinction, leading the chapter through the turbulent years that followed the heresy, with a combination of tactical brilliance and iron-willed determination that earned him the respect of allies and the fear of enemies across the galaxy. But fate was not done with Bjorn. The universe had one more blow to deliver, one more transformation to impose upon a warrior who had already endured more than any mortal should have been asked to bear. The Proxima Rebellion erupted in 934 of the 31st Millennium, as it was one of those savage, bitter conflicts that seemed to spring up like weeds in the aftermath of the heresy, a world or a system turning against the Imperium, forcing the Space Marines to once again shed blood to maintain the fragile unity that the Emperor had tried to build. The Space Wolves were dispatched to deal with the situation, and Bjorn, as Great Wolf, led the assault personally. The target was the Dreadsun Fortress, as a heavily fortified stronghold where the rebels had barricaded themselves, along with several captured Space Wolves who needed to be freed. Bjorn planned and executed the raid himself, leading his warriors into the heart of the enemy's defenses with the kind of reckless courage that had defined his career since the day he first picked up a bolter. The raid was a success. The captured brothers were freed. The fortress was taken. But Bjorn paid a terrible price. Yet the exact nature of his injuries has never been fully recorded, but the result was unambiguous. By the time his warriors pulled him from the wreckage of the final assault, Bjorn's body was broken beyond repair. His spine was shattered. His organs were failing. The apothecaries who examined him could do nothing to restore his ruined flesh. By any reasonable standard, the Great Wolf of the Space Wolves was dying. Any other chapter might have let him go. It might have granted him the mercy of a warrior's death, honored his sacrifice, and carved his name into the halls of remembrance. But the Space Wolves could not lose Bjorn. He was too important, too irreplaceable. He was the last living link to Leman Russ, the only warrior in the chapter who had walked beside the Primarch and spoken with the Emperor and fought in the Age of Legends. His memories, his wisdom, his very existence were sacred to the sons of Fenris, and so, while with a reverence that bordered on desperation, the Iron Priests and Apothecaries of the Space Wolves performed the ancient rite of interment. The process is one of the most harrowing procedures in the Imperium's medical arsenal, a surgical nightmare that strips away everything that makes a warrior human and replaces it with cold, unfeeling metal. What remained of Bjorn's shattered body was carefully extracted from his ruined power armor. Limbs that could not be saved were removed, as organs that had ceased to function were bypassed or replaced with mechanical substitutes. The black carapace, the genetic interface that had once allowed Bjorn to control his armor with thought alone, was fused into new neural connection ports that would link his nervous system to the Dreadnought's cybernetic infrastructure. Cables and synthetic nerve bundles were threaded into his brain and spinal column, binding what was left of his flesh to the machine that would now serve as his body. Yet the sarcophagus itself was filled with amniotic fluid, a thick, numbingly cold liquid that would sustain Bjorn's remaining organic tissue and fill his lungs with every breath. It is a detail that those who speak of the honor of Dreadnought Interment rarely mention. The occupant breathes liquid. Every breath is a reminder that you are no longer a being of flesh and air, but something else entirely. Something caught between life and death, between man and machine. Existing in a state that defies easy classification and mocks the very concept of salvation. Bjorn's shattered body was placed within this cybernetic sarcophagus, a life support system so advanced that it was considered a masterwork of technology, even by the standards of the Horus heresy. The Iron Priests who had maintained the device across the centuries treated it with the same reverence they would show a holy relic, because that is what it was. Says the technology required to construct a Dreadnought sarcophagus was already becoming rare in the 31st millennium, the knowledge slowly slipping away as the artisans who understood it died and were not replaced. Each Dreadnought was an irreplaceable artifact, and the decision to inter a warrior within one was not taken lightly. The sarcophagus was then sealed within the armored shell of a Mark V venerable Dreadnought, as a towering war machine that would become Bjorn's new body for the rest of eternity. The machine stood several times the height of a man, its torso a massive armored block of ceramite and adamantium designed to withstand all but the most devastating weapons in the galaxy's arsenals. Where arms should have been, there were weapon mounts. On one side, a ranged weapon system that could be fitted with anything from assault cannons to plasma cannons to las cannons. On the other, was a close combat weapon of enormous size and power. In Bjorn's case, the Iron Priest crafted a massive lightning claw in homage to the wolf claw he had wielded as a mortal warrior. They called it True Claw, and it would become as much a part of Bjorn's legend as the living hand that had torn out the throat of the arch-slaughterer all those years ago. The neural interfaces that connected Bjorn's consciousness to the Dreadnought systems were remarkably sophisticated. Unlike some of the cruder Dreadnought chassis used by other chapters, Bjorn's sarcophagus gave him reaction times and sensory input far superior to what one would expect from a walking coffin of metal. He could perceive the world through Auspex scanners and targeting feeds. He could hear through acoustic sensors. He could feel, after a fashion, through the pressure readings on the armor plating. But all of it was filtered, translated, reduced to data. The rich, an overwhelming flood of sensation that defined mortal existence was gone, replaced by something colder, cleaner, and infinitely less satisfying. Consider what that means for a moment. Consider what it would feel like to be a warrior who had known the wind on his face, the weight of a blade in his hand, the simple pleasure of breathing clean air and feeling the ground beneath his boots, and then to wake up inside a metal box, to reach for your hands and find weapon mounts, to try to draw breath and hear only the mechanical wheeze of a life support system, to call out in your own voice and hear a grinding synthesized rasp emerge from speakers bolted to your chest. The synthesized voice that emanates from a Dreadnought is described as an eerie experience by those who have conversed with one. It is a voice that carries echoes of the man who once spoke with flesh and blood vocal cords, but filtered through layers of machine processing that strip away the warmth and the nuance and leave only a hollow, crackling approximation of human speech. Some Dreadnoughts develop particular machine quirks over the centuries. Laughter, for instance, might be translated by the Dreadnought systems into the cycling of autocannon rounds, a sound that bears no resemblance to joy but represents the machine's best attempt at expressing it. Consider what that means for a moment. And consider what it would feel like to be a warrior who had known the wind on his face, the weight of a blade in his hand, the simple pleasure of breathing clean air and feeling the ground beneath his boots, and then to wake up inside a metal box. To reach for your hands and find weapon mounts, to try to draw breath and hear only the mechanical wheeze of a life support system, to call out in your own voice and hear a grinding, synthesized rasp emerge from speakers bolted to your chest. Bjorn hated it. Let us be clear about that. He did not embrace his interment as a glorious honor, as the official records might suggest. He was bitter. He was angry. He was a warrior who had already lost his arm, his packmates, and his Primarch, and now the universe had taken his body as well. The sullen temperament that had always been his defining characteristic was only made worse by the cold, mechanical reality of his new existence. The Dreadnought chassis that housed Bjorn was, admittedly, a remarkable piece of technology. It was one of the most advanced sarcophagi in existence at the time, equipped with neural interfaces so sophisticated that they gave Bjorn reaction times and sensory input far superior to what one would expect from a walking coffin of adamantium and ceramite. He could move with something approaching the instinctive fluidity that had characterized his fighting style in the flesh. He could fight on instinct rather than calculated commands. But the iron priests who tended his chassis were meticulous in their work, ensuring that the nerve circuits and feedback systems were maintained at peak efficiency across the centuries. But all the technology in the Imperium could not replace the sensation of cutting an enemy's flesh with a knife and feeling the resistance of bone. It could not replicate the burn of ale in the throat or the warmth of a hearthfire against the skin. It could not give back the hundred small and unremarkable pleasures of physical existence that Bjorn had never thought to value until they were gone forever. They decorated his sarcophagus with elaborate ornamentation, with gilded runes and carved wolf heads and battle honors that glittered in the dim light of the deep halls. Bjorn despised every single one of them. He saw them for what they were, a lie. A pretty facade painted over a prison. He was not a hero to be venerated. He was a broken warrior trapped in a metal cage. Kept alive not for his own benefit, but for the benefit of a chapter that could not bear to let its last connection to Russ slip away. And yet, he fought, because that is what Bjorn does. Over the following 500 years, Bjorn remained at the forefront of battle. His plasma cannon was said to have a personal kill count higher than that of some entire chapters. It's a statistic so staggering that it borders on the absurd until you consider the time span involved and the sheer volume of enemies that the Imperium faced in the centuries following the heresy. He destroyed the demon Thransubber on Algol 7, driving the warp-spawned horror back into the Imperium with a sustained barrage of plasma fire that turned the creature's physical form into superheated vapor. He defeated the greenskin warlord Macrina in the deserts of Qoran, breaking the spine of a massive alien crusade with a single devastating assault that saw him wade into the heart of the greenskin horde and crush the warlord's skull with True Claw. He killed the rogue Psyker Vornalen and ended the Thranks Rebellion, a conflict that had threatened to destabilize an entire subsector. The list of his victories grew longer with every century, each entry a testament to the fury and skill of a warrior who channeled his grief and his rage into an endless campaign of destruction against the enemies of the Imperium. Throughout these 5 centuries of active service, Bjorn also served as counselor and advisor to the great wolves who succeeded him. He was a living repository of tactical knowledge, a walking archive of strategies and counter-strategies accumulated across some of the most brutal conflicts in human history. The young leaders who sought his advice found themselves speaking to a being who had personally commanded Space Marine forces against every major threat the galaxy had to offer. Greenskins, the servants of the dark gods, alien civilizations that had never before been encountered, and renegade human forces that had turned against the Imperium. Bjorn had fought them all, and he remembered what worked and what did not, with a clarity that no written record could match. But the years took their toll. Even a Space Marine's body, sustained by the most advanced life support technology in the galaxy, cannot fight the slow march of entropy forever. The extended neural interface between Bjorn's organic brain and the Dreadnought's cybernetic systems created conditions that all interred warriors eventually face. Lethargy, confusion, a growing disconnect between the rhythms of the human mind and the mechanical processes of the machine. Bjorn began to tire. His periods of activity grew shorter, and his need for rest grew longer. The neural interfaces that connected his consciousness to the Dreadnought's systems required increasingly complex maintenance, each adjustment a delicate balancing act between preserving function and risking further degradation of the organic tissue that sustained his awareness. His organic brain, the last remaining fragment of the man he had once been, showed the inevitable signs of deterioration that accompanied extreme age and prolonged cybernetic interface. Yes, the rune priests made the decision to place Bjorn in stasis between deployments. It was a common practice for dreadnoughts, a way to preserve the occupant's consciousness and slow the deterioration of their organic components. The stasis vaults beneath the Fang were designed for exactly this purpose. Cold chambers, where the dreadnoughts could be sealed away from the passage of time. Their life support systems reduced to the bare minimum necessary to maintain the spark of consciousness within their shells. But for Bjorn, stasis meant something more than mere rest. The amniotic fluid within his sarcophagus would grow cold, the neural interfaces would power down, and his consciousness would sink into a void that was neither sleep nor death, but something in between. There were no dreams in stasis, no warm memories to sustain him through the darkness. Only an absence so complete that when consciousness returned, it was like being born again, pulled from nothingness into a world that had changed in ways he could not predict. Each time he closed his eyes and felt the cold embrace of stasis creeping over his consciousness, he knew that when he woke, the world would have changed. The faces he knew would be gone. The brothers he had fought beside would be dead or aged beyond recognition. Yes, the chapter he loved would have evolved in subtle and not so subtle ways that spoke of decades and centuries passing like heartbeats. The very architecture of the Fang might be different, modified by generations of iron priests who had been born, lived, and died during the span of a single one of Bjorn's naps. And so began the long vigil. The endless cycle of sleeping and waking that would define Bjorn's existence for the next 9,000 years and counting. He would be roused from stasis in times of dire need, when the chapter faced a threat so grave that the wisdom and firepower of its oldest warrior were deemed essential to survival. He would fight, he would counsel, he would grumble about the changes that had been made to his sarcophagus while he slept, and then he would return to the cold darkness beneath the Fang to sleep once more. Each awakening brought its own small shocks and griefs. The first few times, Bjorn recognized some faces, old warriors who had served under him during his years as Great Wolf, now aged and scarred, and leading great companies of their own. But as the centuries stretched into millennia, even these familiar faces disappeared. Bjorn would wake to find himself surrounded by strangers who looked at him with a reverence that he found suffocating. Young warriors who had grown up hearing stories about the fell-handed, the way children hear stories about the heroes of old. To them, he was not a brother. He was a relic, a living artifact to be preserved and displayed, wheeled out on special occasions to remind the chapter of its glorious past. The irony was not lost on Bjorn. He had always been a sullen, introspective warrior who preferred solitude to the boisterous fellowship of the mead hall. Now he had been granted more solitude than any being in the galaxy could possibly want, and he found that it was not the gift he had imagined. Loneliness, it turned out, was worse than any wound he had ever suffered. Worse than losing his arm on Prospero. Worse than watching his packmates burn on Greeth. Worse, even, than watching Russ walk away without looking back. Because those losses, as devastating as they were, had been sharp, sudden. The pain was immense, but finite. The loneliness of Dreadnought existence was different. It was a slow, grinding erosion of everything that connected him to the world of the living, a tide that retreated a little further with every awakening, leaving behind a shoreline of bare stone where once there had been warmth and life and meaning. But not all of his awakenings were for war. Once every century, the space wolves rouse Bjorn from his slumber for a grand banquet. It is a tradition that has endured for thousands of years, a feast where the warriors of the chapter gather in the great hall to hear the eldest speak. They come to hear stories of Leman Russ, of the Great Crusade, of the heresy and the scouring, and the ancient days when gods walked among men. They come to sit at the feet of a living legend and drink in the wisdom of 10 millennia. Bjorn participates in these ceremonies with a mixture of duty and barely concealed irritation. He knows what they want. They want the old stories, the familiar tales of Russ's greatness and the glory of the old days. and Bjorn obliges because he understands his role. Or he understands that he is more than just a warrior to the Space Wolves. He is a symbol, a connection to the past that gives the chapter its identity and its sense of purpose. Without Bjorn, the Space Wolves would be just another chapter of Space Marines, cut off from their roots and adrift in the 41st millennium without an anchor. But there are those who have noted, over the centuries, that Bjorn seems to be getting crankier. His retellings of the old sagas have become increasingly irreverent, but he grumbles about the growing obsession with wolf iconography that has overtaken the chapter since his youth. He makes disparaging remarks about the Thunderwolf cavalry, about the wolf-themed naming conventions that have been applied to every weapon and piece of equipment in the armory, about the general trajectory of Space Wolves culture in the millennia since Russ's departure. Some of the younger Bloodclaws have speculated that the ancient Dreadnought is going senile. The older Longfangs, who know better, suspect that Bjorn is deliberately exaggerating his eccentricity in the hope that the chapter will eventually stop waking him up and let him sleep in peace. Neither assessment is entirely wrong. Bjorn's memories have faded over the millennia, as all organic memories do when subjected to the degrading effects of time and cybernetic interface. Some details have grown fuzzy. Some faces have become indistinct, but his mind remains sharp, his will remains strong, and his ability to cut through nonsense with a single caustic remark remains undiminished. He is the grumpy grandfather of the Space Wolves, the ancient patriarch who loves his family, but is not afraid to tell them when they are being idiots. But the banquets are not the only reason Bjorn is awakened. There have been moments, across the long millennia, when the Space Wolves have faced threats so catastrophic that only the fell-handed could tip the balance between survival and annihilation. And of all the battles Bjorn has fought since his interment in the Dreadnought, none has been more dramatic or more consequential than the Battle of the Fang. It happened in the 32nd millennium, roughly 1,000 years after the Horus heresy. Magnus the Red, the demon primarch of the Thousand Suns, had never forgiven the Space Wolves for the burning of Prospero. The destruction of his homeworld, his legion, had his libraries and his life's work had festered in Magnus's corrupted soul for a millennium, growing into an obsession with revenge that consumed every fiber of his being, and he had devised a plan that was as cunning as it was devastating. First, Magnus baited the trap. The Thousand Suns began conducting raids on worlds neighboring Fenris, striking with just enough force to cause devastation before withdrawing before the Space Wolves could respond. It was a campaign of provocation designed to exploit the greatest weakness of the great wolf of the time, Harek Ironhelm. Ironhelm was a proud and aggressive warrior, and the constant taunting by Magnus drove him to obsession. He became fixated on finding and destroying the demon primarch, committing more and more of the chapter's resources to the hunt. When intelligence finally pinpointed the Thousand Suns on the world of Gangava, Ironhelm took the bait completely. But he led 11 of the 12 great companies, virtually the entire fighting strength of the Space Wolves, to Gangava for what he believed would be the decisive confrontation with Magnus. It was exactly what the demon primarch wanted. With the bulk of the Space Wolves a galaxy away, Magnus unleashed the full might of the Thousand Suns upon Fenris itself. A massive invasion force of rubric marines, sorcerers, and their mortal Spireguard allies descended upon the Fang, which was defended by only a single great company under the command of Jarl Ver Greylock, along with the chapter's serfs and mortal soldiery. It was a skeleton crew facing an army, and Magnus knew it. But he had not counted on one thing. He had not counted on Bjorn. When the first shells began to fall and the alarms began to wail through the corridors of the Fang, Greylock gave the order to wake the revered fallen, the dormant dreadnoughts who slumbered in the deep halls beneath the fortress. And a dozen ancient warriors stirred from their centuries of sleep, their systems cycling up, their weapons charging, their minds clawing their way back to consciousness through the fog of stasis. And chief among them, his sarcophagus gleaming with the runic inscriptions he had always despised, was Bjorn, the fell-handed. When he was briefed on the tactical situation, Bjorn was furious. Not just at the Thousand Sons, though his hatred for them had not dimmed 1 degree since Prospero. Yet he was furious at Ironhelm for the stupidity of committing 11/12 of the chapter to a single mission, leaving Fenris virtually undefended. He was furious at the current generation of Wolf Lords for failing to see the obvious trap that Magnus had laid. And beneath all of that fury, there was something else. Something that burned hotter and deeper than mere anger. Bjorn recognized what was happening. He had seen the Thousand Sons on Prospero. He knew their tactics, their psychology, first their obsessive need for revenge, and he knew that this was personal. Bjorn took command of the defense. He analyzed the Thousand Sons' attack strategy and organized the defenders with the tactical brilliance that had made him the first great wolf 10,000 years earlier. When the Thousand Sons deployed cataphract robots as part of their assault, the automated war machines causing havoc among the Space Wolves' defenders, Bjorn personally intervened, were destroying the robots with a combination of firepower and the sheer, reckless aggression that had always been his specialty. The siege lasted for weeks. 40 days and 40 nights. The defenders of the Fang held the line against an enemy that outnumbered them by a staggering margin. Bjorn was everywhere, directing the defense, shoring up breaches in the line, laying ambushes for the advancing Thousand Sons, and wading into the thickest fighting whenever the enemy threatened to break through. His plasma cannon spoke constantly, its superheated bolts burning through rubric marines and sorcerers alike. His true claw, the massive lightning claw that had been crafted in homage to the wolf claw he had wielded as a mortal warrior, tore through enemy armor with the ease of a knife through wet parchment. But even Bjorn could not hold back a demon primarch forever. Magnus the Red eventually manifested in person within the upper reaches of the Fang. His arrival was not subtle, but the psychic shockwave of a demon primarch materializing in real space was felt by every psyker on the planet, and even Bjorn, entombed within his sarcophagus deep below, could sense the sickening wrongness of Magnus's presence pressing against his consciousness like a hot iron against bare skin. Magnus had come for a specific prize, deep within the Fang. At the Space Wolves, Genesmiths had been working on a secret project, developing a method to create viable successor chapters from the Space Wolves' notoriously unstable gene seed. Magnus wanted this research destroyed. He wanted to ensure that the Space Wolves could never reproduce, that they would dwindle and die out over the millennia, a slow extinction that would be far more agonizing than any single defeat on the battlefield. He succeeded. As the genesmith Tharhraldir threw himself at the demon primarch in a desperate attempt to protect his work, but Magnus killed him with barely a thought. With Hraldir's death, the knowledge of how to stabilize the Space Wolves' gene seed was lost to the Imperium. It was a blow that would haunt the chapter for millennia. But Magnus was not content with simply destroying the research. He wanted blood. He wanted to feel the bones of the Space Wolves break beneath his fists and hear them scream as they died. And so, when Jarl Greylock led a desperate counter-assault to engage the Daemon Primarch, Magnus was waiting. Greylock brought everything he had. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the Rune Priest, Odain Stormyart, his own Wolf Guard, 5 of the chapter's mightiest heroes, each a warrior of incredible skill and experience. Against a Daemon Primarch, it should have been enough to at least give the monster a fight. It was not enough. The battle moved from the ruins of Hraldir's laboratory into an aircraft hangar near the peak of the Fang, the combatants destroying everything around them in their fury. Magnus was a being of godlike power, a fusion of sorcery and physical might that defied comprehension. One wolf guard was flung across the hangar, his skull crushed. Another had his spine broken by a single strike. Stormyart was killed by witchfire. And Greylock, the brave and capable Jarl who had held the Fang for 40 days against impossible odds, was murdered by Magnus with his bare hands. That left Bjorn, alone, against a demon primarch. Any rational assessment of the situation would have concluded that the fight was over. Bjorn was a 10,000-year-old warrior entombed in a machine that was ancient when the current millennium began. Ois Magnus was a being of near unlimited psychic power, whose physical form could shrug off wounds that would have killed a titan. There was no scenario in which Bjorn should have survived, let alone inflicted meaningful damage. Bjorn did not care about rational assessments. He closed with Magnus, his plasma cannon blazing, his true claw crackling with barely contained energy. And in the duel that followed, as the fell-handed inflicted upon Magnus the Red the greatest damage that the demon Primarch had suffered to any physical form since the burning of Prospero 1,000 years before. Bjorn burned him with plasma fire. He cut him with the lightning claw. He wounded the demon Primarch in ways that should have been impossible for a being of his nature, driven not by psychic power or divine favor, but by 10 millennia of cold, concentrated fury. Even after Magnus destroyed both of Bjorn's weapon arms, and rendering the Dreadnought effectively defenseless, Bjorn did not stop. He tried to ram the demon Primarch off the cliff edge with the sheer mass of his armored body. He refused, categorically and absolutely, to die. Magnus paused. He looked at the battered, disarmed Dreadnought with something that might have been curiosity. And in that moment, the demon Primarch recognized the soul inside the machine. He could see the psychic imprint, the trace of a warrior he had last sensed on Prospero, 1,000 years ago. "Did you really think you could kill me?" Magnus demanded, his voice dripping with contempt. "Did you dare think you could do anything to me when my brothers couldn't?" Bjorn, his vox speakers shattered, his weapons destroyed, his body beaten to the edge of oblivion, could not respond. But if he could have, one suspects his answer would have been characteristically blunt. Magnus raised his fist to deliver the killing blow, and at that exact moment, a drop pod slammed into the peak of the Fang with the force of a meteor. Harak Ironhelm had returned. The great wolf, having finally realized the trap that had been laid for him, had raced back to Fenris with everything he had. His drop pod impacted on the very summit of the Fang, and without hesitation, Ironhelm leapt from the wreckage and hurled himself at Magnus, smashing into the demon Primarch just as the killing blow was about to fall on Bjorn. After the impact knocked all three of them off the cliff edge in an avalanche of rock and ceramite and burning sorcery. Ironhelm was wounded. Bjorn was taken out of the fight entirely, his systems critically damaged. But the most damage was suffered by Magnus. The demon Primarch's physical form, already weakened by Bjorn's relentless assault, was further degraded by Ironhelm's life-threatening attack. The Thousand Sons, seeing their master wounded and their assault faltering, began to withdraw. Ere Magnus, his scheme only partially successful and his body broken, retreated back into the warp. The Fang had held, barely, at a terrible cost in lives and irreplaceable knowledge, but it had held. And at the center of that defense, battered beyond recognition, but still stubbornly, impossibly alive, was Bjorn the Fell-Handed. They collected his broken body from the base of the cliff. They repaired his shattered systems. They replaced his destroyed weapons, and then, yet with the tenderness of warriors caring for a beloved elder, they carried him back down to the deep halls beneath the Fang and returned him to his stasis cradle. Bjorn slept, and the centuries turned. The next major awakening came thousands of years later, in the aftermath of one of the most shameful episodes in the Imperium's history. The First War for Armageddon, fought in 444 of the 41st Millennium, saw the forces of chaos, led by the demon Primarch Angron and his World Eaters, invade the hive world of Armageddon. The Space Wolves, under the command of Great Wolf Logan Grimnar, played a pivotal role in the defense of the planet, fighting alongside the Grey Knights and the Armageddon Steel Legion to defeat the Chaos Invasion. The war was won. Angron was banished back to the warp by the combined efforts of the Grey Knights. The Imperium had triumphed, but the aftermath would prove more damaging than the war itself. The Inquisition, acting under the authority of Lord Inquisitor Gesme Kisneros, decided that the surviving population of Armageddon, the millions of soldiers and civilians who had witnessed the existence of chaos demons and the betrayal of the Primarchs, could not be allowed to spread this knowledge. a general purge was ordered. The surviving civilians were to be herded into labor camps and sterilized. The Armageddon Steel Legion survivors, or the brave men and women who had fought and bled alongside the Space Marines, were to be destroyed in their transport ships. Logan Grimnar was outraged. He had fought beside these people. He had watched them stand against demons and Chaos Space Marines with nothing but laser guns and courage. And now the Inquisition wanted to reward their sacrifice with death. The Great Wolf refused to comply. And when the Inquisition began to carry out its purge anyway, Grimnar retaliated. What followed was a series of escalating confrontations between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition that would become known as the Months of Shame. The Grey Knights, those elite demon hunters of the Ordo Malleus, found themselves caught in the middle, forced to fight against fellow Space Marines in a conflict that made a mockery of everything they were supposed to stand for. Ships were destroyed. Warriors died. The situation spiraled toward full-scale war. With neither side willing to back down, the crisis reached its climax when Kisnaros brought his fleet to Fenris itself, intending to force the Space Wolves into submission. The Inquisitor Lord had an extraordinary cross-sector mandate and freedom of action, and his armada had ranged far and wide, raining death onto anyone or anything whose misfortune was to have crossed paths with Armageddon survivors. Worlds had been cleansed. Transport ships had been destroyed in the void with all hands aboard. The scope of the purge had expanded far beyond anything that could be justified by legitimate security concerns. And yet Kisnaros continued to press forward, driven by a combination of genuine paranoia about chaos contamination and an institutional arrogance that made him incapable of admitting that he might be wrong. Within the inquisitorial forces themselves, dissent was growing. The Grey Knights, those supreme warriors of the Ordo Malleus, who had been created specifically to fight demons, were increasingly uncomfortable with being used as enforcers against loyal Imperial citizens and fellow Space Marines. They had not been forged in the fires of psychic warfare to slaughter guardsmen on transport ships. Several Grey Knights openly questioned the morality and the wisdom of the campaign. The Fenrisian Inquisitor, Annika Jarlsdottir, was among the most vocal of the dissenters within the inquisitorial ranks, her native loyalty to the people of Fenris warring with her duty to the Ordos. And through it all, Logan Grimnar held the moral high ground with an iron grip. The Space Wolves never fired first. In every engagement, they absorbed the Inquisition's attacks without retaliating, and a restraint that was as politically astute as it was infuriating for the hot-blooded warriors of the chapter. They suffered damage to their ships. They endured provocations that would have pushed less disciplined chapters into full-scale war. And they waited, with the patience of predators, for the right moment to strike. That moment came when Kisnaros brought his fleet to Fenris. By this point, the conflict had gone too far. The Inquisition had fired upon Space Wolf escort ships during what was supposed to be a parley. The betrayal was the final straw. Grimnar, his fury stoked beyond reason by months of watching the Inquisition murder the innocents he had sworn to protect, boarded Kisnaros' flagship with his Wolf Guard and launched a devastating assault. The Grey Knights aboard fought to protect their masters, but they were torn between duty and conscience. Knowing that the Space Wolves were not the enemy they had been created to face, the fighting was brutal and ugly, the kind of internecine bloodshed that dishonored everyone involved. Grimnar reached Kisnaros on the bridge. The Lord Inquisitor was unarmed, though he was a powerful psyker with telekinetic abilities. Whether he chose not to defend himself or simply could not react quickly enough to the Great Wolf's speed and ferocity remains a matter of debate. Either way, the result was the same. Grimnar killed Kisnaros with a single stroke of his axe, decapitating the architect of the Purge with the same casual efficiency that he might have used on a greenskin raider. It was an act of righteous rage, but it threatened to escalate the conflict into something that could not be undone. The death of a Lord Inquisitor at the hands of a Space Marine chapter master was an event with implications that reached far beyond the orbit of Fenris. And that is when the Space Wolves did what they always do in their darkest hour. They woke Bjorn. The Fell-Handed was roused from his stasis cradle and briefed on the situation. And once again, Bjorn proved that his value to the Space Wolves extended far beyond his ability to kill things. Where Grimna was a warrior consumed by righteous fury, Bjorn was a diplomat. Where the Great Wolf saw enemies to be destroyed, the Fell-Handed saw a problem to be solved. Bjorn teleported to the bridge of Kisnaros's flagship, the Coral's Hope. It was the first time in his entire existence that Bjorn had used a teleporter, and he had always been deeply hesitant about the technology. But the situation demanded it, and Bjorn was not the sort of warrior to let personal discomfort stand in the way of what needed to be done. His arrival on the bridge was dramatic in a way that only a 10,000-year-old Dreadnought can manage. As the combat that had been raging between the Space Wolves and the Grey Knights stopped immediately, every warrior on both sides turned to stare at the towering war machine that had just materialized in their midst. And then, something remarkable happened. When the Grey Knights and the surviving inquisitorial delegation realized who they were looking at, when they understood that this was Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the warrior who had fought beside the Emperor and Leman Russ during the Great Crusade, as a warrior whose existence predated their organizations by millennia, even these hardened warriors found themselves falling to their knees in awe. Bjorn found this exasperating. The exchange between Bjorn and Kisnaros's successor, conducted while the bodies of the slain still lay cooling on the deck plates, was a masterclass in pragmatic diplomacy. Bjorn told Grimna that the war had gone on long enough. The inquisitorial forces would be allowed to leave Fenris unscathed. The Space Wolves would reach an understanding with the Imperium. The internecine bloodshed would stop, here and now. Then Bjorn turned to the inquisitorial delegation and laid down his own terms. No Inquisition vessel would ever again appear above Fenris. The Space Wolves who had gained knowledge of the Grey Knight's existence would not be mind-scrubbed, as was customary. And in a demand that revealed the depth of Bjorn's wisdom and his understanding of what really mattered. He asked for one more thing. A Grey Knight would come down to the Fang and speak to the Space Wolves about their order, because the Wolves would remember them, not as enemies, not as adversaries, but as warriors who had been caught up in a shameful conflict that should never have happened. Both sides accepted. The months of shame came to an end, not with a final battle or a dramatic last stand, but with a 10,000-year-old warrior in a metal box telling everyone to stop being ridiculous and sort things out like adults. It was, in many ways, the most important thing Bjorn had ever done. More important than slaying the arch-slaughterer, more important than wounding Magnus the Red, because in that moment, Bjorn saved not just the Space Wolves, but the Grey Knights as well, from a conflict that would have damaged both chapters beyond repair. While he saw past the fury and the pride and the righteous indignation and focused on what mattered: survival, unity, the preservation of the warriors who would be needed to fight the real enemies of the Imperium. That is Bjorn's greatest gift. Not his firepower, not his tactical brilliance, not even his 10 millennia of combat experience. Though all of these things are invaluable, Bjorn's greatest gift is perspective. He has lived long enough to see the consequences of rash action play out across centuries. He has watched empires fall because of a single moment of unchecked rage. He has seen what happens when warriors forget that the true enemy is out there, in the void, and start turning their weapons on each other. After the months of shame, Bjorn was returned to stasis once more. The centuries continued to pile up like snow on the peaks of Ascension. The Imperium lurched from crisis to crisis, or its borders shrinking, its enemies multiplying, its light growing dimmer with every passing year. The 41st Millennium gave way to the 42nd, and still Bjorn slumbered beneath the Fang, his life support systems humming softly in the darkness, his consciousness drifting in the grey void of stasis sleep. He would be woken again, of course. He always is. When the Tyranid splinter fleet designated Kraken spawn threatened the Space Wolves' sector of space, Bjorn was roused to lend his firepower and his wisdom to the defense. During the siege of the Fenris system, when Magnus the Red returned once more with his 1,000 sons and an army of demons, Bjorn was there, standing in defense of his home, as he had done countless times before. Every few centuries, when the chapter faces a threat, that requires the full weight of its history and its strength, the Iron Priests descend into the deep halls and begin the ancient ritual of awakening. The process is always the same. The systems cycle up one by one, the life support engages, the neural interfaces reconnect, and somewhere deep inside the armored shell, a consciousness stirs. A mind that has witnessed more of human history than any other being in the galaxy claws its way back from the abyss of non-existence and asks, with varying degrees of irritation, why it has been disturbed. Who awakens Bjorn? The Vox speakers crackle. It is a ritual question, and a tradition as old as the Interment itself. And the assembled space wolves, gathered in the deep halls with reverence and barely concealed excitement, deliver the ritual answer. They speak of honor and duty and the needs of the chapter. They speak of enemies that must be faced and wisdom that must be shared. And Bjorn, the oldest warrior in the Imperium of man, the last of the company of Russ, the fell-handed, the eldest, the true claw, the revered one, takes a moment to assess the situation. Well, he looks at the faces of the young warriors gathered before him. Faces that belong to men who were not born when he last walked the halls of the Fang. He looks at the decorations that have been added to his sarcophagus while he slept, the new honors and runes and gilded wolf heads that he has asked them repeatedly to stop putting on him. He feels the weight of 10,000 years pressing down on the last functioning neurons of his organic brain, and he wonders, as he always does, whether this will be the last time. And then he speaks. His voice, that mechanical rasp that sounds nothing like the man he used to be, but carries all of his stubbornness and all of his fire, fills the chamber. And the space wolves lean in, because whatever else may have changed in the 10,000 years since the Age of Legends, Bjorn still has stories to tell. He speaks of Russ. He speaks of the Emperor. He speaks of Prospero and the Alax's Nebula, and the Arch-Slaughterer, and the long vigil that has defined his existence. He speaks of things that no other living being can remember, events that have passed from history into legend, and from legend into myth. And for the young bloodclaws who hear him, warriors who have never known a galaxy that was not consumed by war and darkness, Bjorn's words are more than just stories. They are proof that the old days were real, proof that the Emperor lived and walked among his people, proof that Leman Russ existed and will, out one day, return. The only moment where Bjorn's voice falters, the only moment where the grinding mechanical rasp softens into something that might almost be mistaken for vulnerability, is when he speaks of the day Russ left. 10,000 years, and the pain is still as fresh as it was on that day in the Great Hall. The rejection, the bewilderment, the terrible aching sense of being left behind by the one person in the universe whose approval he craved above all others. There are those among the space wolves who believe that Bjorn's legendary anger, the cold, bitter fury that has sustained him through 10 millennia of warfare, is rooted in that moment. They believe that Russ left Bjorn behind because he knew that Bjorn's anger would keep him alive, would keep him sane, would give him the strength to endure an existence that would have driven any other warrior into madness or despair. If that is true, and then Russ's gamble has paid off beyond anything the Primarch could have imagined, because Bjorn has endured. Through every battle and every silence, through every awakening and every return to the cold darkness of stasis, through the slow, inexorable decay of his memories and the gradual erosion of everything that once made him human, Bjorn has endured. He has been wounded, repaired, wounded again, repaired again. Of an endless cycle of destruction and restoration that has continued for longer than most civilizations managed to exist. And still he fights, still he counsels, still he grumbles about the wolf-themed naming conventions, still he sits at the head of the table during the centennial feasts and tells the old stories, because someone has to remember, and there is no one left who remembers but him. On the tabletop, Bjorn is one of the most iconic special characters in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. He fights as a venerable Dreadnought, armed with his trademark assault cannon and the massive lightning claw known as True Claw. His rules reflect both his incredible age and his enduring prowess. The ability called Legendary Tenacity allows him to shrug off wounds that would cripple other dreadnoughts, subtracting from enemy wound rolls when the strength of the incoming attack exceeds his toughness. While Ancient Tactician, another of his signature abilities, generates additional command points for his army at the start of each command phase, representing the 10,000 years of tactical experience that Bjorn brings to every engagement. And his presence on the battlefield inspires the space wolves around him, allowing nearby units to re-roll failed hit rolls as they fight with renewed fury in the presence of their revered elder. But Bjorn is more than just a set of statistics and special rules. He is a symbol. He is the living embodiment of everything the space wolves believe in: loyalty, endurance, the refusal to surrender no matter how dire the circumstances. He is proof that even in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, a single warrior can endure long enough to make a difference. Not through blind obedience or mechanical compulsion, but through the sheer, stubborn force of a human soul that refuses to be extinguished. And that, ultimately, is what separates Bjorn from every other dreadnought in the Imperium. Other dreadnoughts are honored warriors, preserved in iron and adamantium, their consciousness maintained by machines that are ancient beyond comprehension. Many of them lose their minds over the centuries, descending into a fog of confusion and disorientation that makes them dangerous to friend and foe alike. Others maintain their sanity, but lose their humanity, becoming cold and efficient, killing machines that process the world around them as data rather than experience. Bjorn has lost things. He will admit that freely. Memories have faded. Faces have grown indistinct. The sound of his own voice, the voice he had before the machines replaced his larynx with vox speakers, is a distant whisper that grows fainter with every awakening. He cannot remember what it felt like to run, to breathe, as to feel the wind on his face or the warmth of a fire against his skin. These things are gone, and they will never come back. But Bjorn has held on to the things that matter. His loyalty to the chapter. His love for the brothers who fight beside him, even if he will not remember their names by the time he next awakens. His bitter, abiding hope that one day, Russ will return, and Bjorn will be there to fight at his side once more. And beneath all of that, a deeper than the loyalty and the love and the hope, there is the anger. That cold, black, magnificent fury that has burned in his chest for 10,000 years. The anger of a warrior who was left behind by his father and refused to be broken by it. Russ knew. He must have known. When he looked at that young, one-armed warrior standing in the Great Hall, when he chose to leave Bjorn behind, while taking every other member of his wolf guard with him, Russ must have seen what we see now. A soul that could not be broken. A will that could not be bent. A fire that would burn for 10,000 years and more, kept alive by the very rejection that fueled it. And if the legends are true, if Russ truly is out there somewhere in the depths of the galaxy, searching for a way to save the Emperor and return to his people, then the Wolf King knows one thing with absolute certainty. Whenever he returns, no matter how many centuries or millennia have passed, but there will be one warrior waiting for him. One battered, ancient, impossibly stubborn warrior, entombed in a metal shell that is more scar tissue than armor, who has spent 10,000 years guarding the legacy that Russ left behind. And when that day comes, when the wolf time descends upon the galaxy and the final battle begins, Bjorn the Fell-Handed will be there. He will be angry. He will have a great many things to say about the state of the chapter and the ridiculous amount of wolf-themed ornamentation that has been bolted onto his sarcophagus. He will probably complain about being woken up again, but he will fight, because that is what Bjorn does. He endures, he fights, and he remembers. And in a galaxy where memory is the most precious and fragile thing of all, where the past is constantly being rewritten, and the truth is buried beneath layers of propaganda and myth and the simple, merciless erosion of time, Bjorn's memory is a flame that will not be extinguished, not by 10,000 years of war, not by the slow decay of his organic brain, not by the cold, mechanical void of stasis sleep, not by anything. He is the eldest. He is the fell-handed. He is the last from the company of Russ. And until the wolf time comes, until the final battle that will decide the fate of everything, he will be there, waiting, watching, remembering. For 10,000 years, that has been enough. Beneath the Fang, in the deep halls where the cold seeps through stone, and the only sound is the distant hum of generators that have been running since before the current chapter master's grandfather was born, a single sarcophagus hums with the ghost light of active life support. Its occupant sleeps. He dreams, if dreadnoughts dream, how, of a wolf-pelted hall, and the roar of laughter, and a towering figure with eyes like winter stars, who one day rose from his seat and walked away without looking back. And somewhere, in the depths of whatever consciousness still flickers behind those dormant optical senses, Bjorn the Fell-Handed is still waiting. He will wait as long as it takes. There is something else worth mentioning about Bjorn, something that often gets lost in the spectacle of his battles and the grandeur of his legend. And that is the simple, human quality of his grief. Bjorn is not a hero in the traditional sense. He did not seek glory. He did not chase legends or cultivate a reputation. He was a sullen, brooding warrior who shot down a civilian shuttle by accident and spent his early career babysitting a remembrancer as punishment. His rise to greatness was not the result of ambition, but of circumstances that he did not choose and in many cases actively resented. Well, he lost his arm because he happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He lost his pack because the universe does not care about the bonds of brotherhood when there is a demon king to be fed. He lost his Primarch because Russ chose to walk away and could not be bothered to explain why. And he lost his body because he was too stubborn to die when a fortress fell on top of him. Every single thing that makes Bjorn legendary was born from loss. Every title, every honor, every battle scar etched into his ancient sarcophagus represents something that was taken from him rather than something he gained. The Fell-Handed lost his hand. The first great wolf lost his Primarch. The eldest lost his youth, his body, his voice, his breath, his sense of touch, and the faces of every brother he has ever known. And yet he persists. Not because he is too proud to die or too powerful to be killed, but because somewhere in the depths of his metal prison, as a man named Bjorn still believes that the universe owes him something, an explanation, a reunion, a chance to look Lemon Russ in the eye and ask the question that has burned in his chest for 10,000 years. Why did you leave me behind? That question is the core of Bjorn's character. It is the wound that never heals, the engine that drives him forward, the fire that keeps his consciousness burning in the darkness of stasis. Without it, Bjorn might have succumbed to the same fate that claims so many dreadnoughts. The slow, merciful descent into confusion and oblivion that eventually erases the man and leaves only the machine. But Bjorn's anger, his legendary, magnificent 10,000-year-old anger, will not let him go gently. It demands that he stay awake, stay present, stay furious, because somewhere out there in the vast darkness between the stars, a father owes his son an answer. And that is why Bjorn matters. Not because he is the oldest, not because he is the most powerful, not because he fought beside the Emperor or slew a demon king or wounded a demon Primarch or talked an Inquisitor into submission. Bjorn matters because he is, despite everything that has been done to him, despite 10 millennia of mechanical existence and the slow erosion of his memories and the soul-crushing loneliness of being the last of his kind, fundamentally and irreducibly human. He feels, he grieves, he rages, he hopes, yet he remembers, even when remembering hurts more than any weapon in the galaxy could hurt. He chooses, again and again and again, to be more than just a weapon with thoughts. And in a universe that seems specifically designed to crush the humanity out of everyone who lives in it, that choice is the most heroic thing anyone can do. The Space Wolves understand this on some level, even if they cannot articulate it. Or when they gather in the Great Hall for the Centennial Feast and listen to Bjorn grumble about the state of the chapter, and tell stories about Leman Russ that make the Wolf King sound considerably less dignified than the official histories would suggest. They are not just listening to a history lesson. They are witnessing an act of defiance. Every word that comes out of Bjorn's Vox speakers is a declaration of war against the entropy that seeks to reduce him to silence. Every cranky, irreverent, our brutally honest observation about the state of the galaxy is proof that the man inside the machine is still alive, still awake, still fighting. There is a beautiful and terrible irony in the fact that the Space Wolves, a chapter founded on the principles of savage warfare and the glory of death in battle, owe their spiritual identity to a warrior who cannot die. Bjorn is the antithesis of everything the sons of Russ are supposed to aspire to. He did not die gloriously in combat. Why, he did not fall with a weapon in his hand and a war cry on his lips. He did not earn his place in the halls of the honored dead. Instead, he was dragged back from the brink of death, stuffed into a metal coffin, and told that his service would continue whether he liked it or not. And yet, somehow, impossibly, Bjorn has made this ignoble survival into something grander than any warrior's death could ever be, while he has transformed the curse of Dreadnought existence into an epic saga that the Skalds will be singing for as long as there are Space Wolves to sing. The specifics of how Bjorn's story will end remain unknown. Perhaps one day, the wolf time will come, and Leman Russ will return from wherever he has been for the last 10,000 years, and Bjorn will finally get to fight beside his Primarch one last time. Perhaps the legend is true, and the spirit of Russ watches over Bjorn, protecting him from harm until the day when the father and son are reunited on the field of the final battle. Perhaps Bjorn will simply go on, century after century, millennium after millennium, waking and sleeping and fighting and remembering, until the stars themselves burn out and the universe falls silent. Whatever happens, one thing is certain. When Bjorn the Fell-Handed finally lays down his burden and surrenders to the peace that has been denied him for so long, the galaxy will have lost something irreplaceable. Not just a warrior, though he is among the greatest the Imperium has ever known. Not just a leader, though his counsel has saved the Space Wolves from destruction more times than anyone can count. Not just a repository of ancient knowledge, though his memories span a period of history that would otherwise be completely lost to the fog of time. When Bjorn falls silent, the galaxy will have lost its oldest living connection to a time when things were different, when the Emperor walked among his people, when the Primarchs led their legions across the stars, when the Imperium was young and full of possibility, and the darkness had not yet closed in on all sides. Bjorn is the last ember of that age, the final flicker of a fire that was kindled 10,000 years ago and has been slowly dying ever since. And when that ember goes out, there will be no one left who remembers what the flame looked like at its brightest. But that is a story for another day. Today, Bjorn sleeps. His sarcophagus hums softly in the deep halls beneath the Fang, surrounded by the silent forms of other dreadnoughts who have long since surrendered to the void. The Iron Priests tend to his systems with the care of devoted acolytes maintaining a sacred shrine. The warriors of the chapter go about their business above, training and feasting and preparing for the next war, secure in the knowledge that far below them, beneath layers of stone and adamantium and sacred warding, the eldest watches over them in his sleep. And somewhere in the vastness of the warp, or in the twisted depths of the Eye of Terror, or on a path that no mortal mind can comprehend, a wolf howls. And maybe, just maybe, that howl carries with it a promise that one day, when the final darkness descends and the last battle begins, a father will return to find his son waiting where he left him, still angry, still fighting, still enduring. Thank you all for listening to this saga of the Imperium's oldest and most enduring warrior. If Bjorn's story stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of 10,000 years pressing down on your shoulders as you listened, then I would be honored if you would hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. As every subscriber brings us one step closer to telling more stories from this incredible universe. Stories of heroes and monsters, and the thin, bright line of humanity that persists even in the darkest of futures. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on Bjorn, or let me know which saga you would like to hear next. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is always someone who refuses to give up. Thank you for watching Q on 40,000. I will see you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.